Dattani, the City of Burnaby Assistant Director of Engineering, and Chris Bowcock, City of Burnaby Deputy Fire Chief.
Thank you, Carl, for the invitation. We're certainly quite pleased to be here again today, and I think this is our second time. Both Chris and I were here previously at another meeting, town hall meeting, and as I say, it's a pleasure to speak to you tonight. So what we heard from the organizers is that we were to focus our discussion on the risk assessment for the Burnaby terminal as it relates to the Trans Mountain expansion project. So tonight's presentation outline is as follows. We'll be talking about the Burnaby terminal. Chris is going to walk us through this process and the review of the risk analysis that was done. Part of the slide presentations, you do see them out in the boards in the back. So if you have more questions to ask afterwards, you can definitely do so. And then I think we're also going to touch on the emergency response and evacuation, because I heard that there's questions on evacuation and how that could be done, etc. I would also like to take this opportunity to speak to the group about the city's response to Trans Mountain Expansion Project Ministerial Panel. And there'll be some, I think we've got some letters that we will be handing out. Ashley's going to do that. I'll give you an opportunity to also read that letter that was written by the mayor to the panel, and I'll be touching on that portion as well. And then we'll open up to the questions. Is that what we're going to do, Carl?
There'll be written questions that will be posted.
Okay. So without further ado, I'll introduce again Deputy Fire Chief Chris Bowcock. Thank you.
Thanks, Dipak, and thanks for having me. I enjoy my time speaking and educating and talking about facts and realities. So we'll kind of get started here. I'll flash through some of these slides rather quickly, but I'm going to explain how we came to identify the concerns that the city had on a risk assessment basis. So we're going to go ahead here. We focused initially just on the tank farm, Kinder Morgan's current tank farm, and this is a topographical view of that tank farm as it exists now. And I'll explain, this isn't the best picture explaining it, but as we go forward, I'll show you the advantages in how this was designed initially and then the changes in the new plan going forward. But currently, from the previous slide to bring you up to speed, that's the current tankage, and the yellow tanks indicate the new tankage. So there's a significant amount of density increase in that facility, almost pushing tanks out to every available space. You can also see here the blue lines indicate the natural waterways through the city, which are numerous and valuable, and the risk and harm you could imagine to those waterways should product leave its containment. Here's another picture, the tunnel entry to the proposed movement of the pipeline from the terminal to the marine facility. So in the risk assessment, the key portions of the risk assessment were the appropriate location of the facility. Typically, when you're designing a hydrocarbon facility, there's some premises for limiting risk. One is you like to have as flat a land as you can so that the dispersal of released product is limited and easily controlled. Also, you'd like a lot of access around each individual component, in this case tanks, so that you can get good access to control and or confine any release or fire that occurs. Thirdly, you'd like the tanks to be far enough apart that you can access, or if you're unable to control the fire where it sits, you contain it, and as it's allowed to burn out and you pump it out, there's no exposure to additional events, meaning no consequential second fire, third fire, and the event gets bigger and bigger, meaning you've really fenced it in on its property line and it's done. So the location, you know, I'm leading you down a garden path, and everyone here is smart enough to know that not a lot of these things are in place at the current facility. As a result of this, because of the expansion plan, there's risks associated with multiple events. When we go back, and the next slide's coming up, and you see how close the tanks are proposed to be, they are not isolated from one another, in that the potential for fire and heat outfall will consequentially affect the next tank. Meaning the event is almost designed to, if it progresses to a large state fire, be inextinguishable due to a lack of access for firefighters, because the tanks are so tight and the heat wave will be so close. Also that the exposures, the next tank will catch on fire, or the wooded area beside it. As the tanks reduce in space distance, therefore, and firefighting operations will become predictably less successful, if at all, the priority for evacuation goes up. So the demand on emergency service is going up. It's going to be very hard to get in there. It's going to be very risky. So you need more people to do that, more resources. At the same time, you're identifying whether this fire can be successfully met, or do we need to start evacuation. The reality in this case, with a tank farm in this location, this close to sensitive life and sensitive environment, is that there's no time to waste before we start that evacuation. We need to be at the front. So we don't have one task to do. We have one very large task to do, and a subsequent or parallel task of evacuating. So we're getting this compounding magnitude of resources just based on design. So I'll move on. The configuration of the tank is so tight, it'd be very difficult for responders to get in safely and or to effectively mitigate many instances of event. Meaning if you can't put it out, it has to burn out. The problem of an event burning out of a tank has always been a contingency plan, but very, very often facilities aren't located in such proximity to such dense population, and thus lies a bit of the problem. And really, just by doing some basic math, the risk to the outside facility of exposure raises about 70% with the new tank facility configuration. So we'll look at it really quickly here. So there's the proposed tank configuration. Oops, oh, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry, I'm not an Apple guy. So currently, this is what the current tank farm looks like. And you'll notice there's only 2 tanks with red circles, meaning the exposure of an event affects another tank or an exposure area. In the bottom corner, you can see it just barely touches that wooded area. In the middle area, you can see tanks without red circles around them. And if you look, they're offset distances, and they have wide spaces between them with lots of access. Someone who planned this or approved this had something very specific in mind for eliminating risk by isolation. If we go to the proposed plan, and you just simply draw the heat outfall potential in all directions, because wind in our area can come from all directions, you see a mass difference in the overlaying of one event across another event. This is a significant issue. In the previous, there's 2 main tanks of moderate concern. In the proposed, there's not a lot of time to waste. The outfall potentials, of course, are Burnaby Mountain with limited access from or egress from that facility. You have an uphill direction, which in forest fire terms is a rapid spread, never be positioned uphill. It leaves very little safe positions for the fire department to position to contain an event of this magnitude should it make it to the wooded area and start to progress uphill. Also in the downhill areas to the south, you have a lot of highly populated areas with schools, high-density living. The boil-over impact is is a 10-tank diameter. So from worst-case scenario for tank failure is a fire that would emit some kind of a negative impact in this area. You can see with all the tanks there, it spans a very large area, and we get to see some magnitude of potential impacts from the facility. And just in summary, you have to the south there, you have very high life hazard areas. To the north in SFU, you have some very isolated areas that are difficult to move people away from, and a huge environmentally sensitive and valuable area to both the citizens of Burnaby, the city itself, and the entire community of Metro Vancouver. And I'll pass it over to Dipak now for some of the summary points.
So just speaking on the emergency response and evacuation, we note that Kinder Morgan still refuses to provide unredacted emergency response plans for the proposed project of its facilities unless certain conditions are accepted. Now this is unprecedented. I haven't heard that in my career where an industry would say sign up to these conditions and then and only then you can see unredacted plan. So from our perspective, they haven't fully given us the picture that we need to see to evaluate both the capacity and capability of Kinder Morgan and its staff or its contractors to respond effectively to fire and spill-related emergencies and to ensure that there is containment within the facilities. Hence, when we talk about evacuation, what does that evacuation look like? We can't stand here before you and say that this is how it's going to work, because it's event specific, and it is also, when we deal with evacuations outside of their boundary, it's understanding the context of their capabilities, capacities, and strategies in management of those events. And that is a significant challenge. So what Chris has shown to you today, hopefully, re-emphasize the fact that these are real concerns. These are real concerns posed by the project. And from our perspective, based on the NEB report, the board essentially accepted Burnaby's concerns with Burnaby Terminal in terms of proximity to the neighborhoods, the containment of spill, boil over, and containment of fire is a valid concern. But guess what the board says? The board also says that the Trans Mountain did not quantify the risk through rigorous analysis, and that the board is of the view that a complete assessment of risk requires consideration of cumulative risk from all tanks at the terminal. But what did the board do in the report? The board simply says that, demonstrate that mitigation measures would reduce the risk as low as reasonably practical, and that Trans Mountain has the capacity to respond to such risks. And these are, by the way, you don't have to believe me on the face of things. You can look at conditions 22, 29, and 22, 24, and 129 of the NEB report, and you will see what I'm saying. And again, we stress that Kinder Morgan is fully responsible for what's happening in their facilities, and in absence of understanding that, it makes it a challenge as to how those evacuations will occur. I want to now take you to August 9th of 2016, when the mayor made a presentation to the Trans Mountain Expansion Project Ministerial Panel. In this oral submission, the mayor expressed significant concerns that he has on behalf of the city and its residents with respect to the project. He also had concerns about the process in which this review was undertaken. At that time, the mayor had indicated to the panel and made a commitment that he would provide written submission as well. And before you, some of you may have copies. I didn't know how many people were going to come tonight. So we had about 40 to 50 copies made, and I hope that there's enough circulating or you can share. But the copy of the report's also available on our website, so if you want to go to the link and then download or view it, that's great. But you will see in this 11-page letter, the mayor speaks quite eloquently and expresses his concerns about the outstanding matters that we have with the project. But more importantly, I just want to focus back on what the organizers of this meeting said to us and said, can you talk about the Burnaby terminal? In that context, on that letter on page 5 and 6, you will note that with respect to multiple tank failure and boil over to Forest Grove neighborhood and surrounding community, NEB requires Trans Mountain to file an updated risk assessment 6 months prior to construction. This is conditions 22 and 129. I don't read the words review, put out for consultation or input. I don't read that. So in my simplistic view of world, that means they just have to file. In terms of the evacuation, which is another point that the group wanted us to speak about, I point you to this particular matter. We stated there's no evacuations for specific scenarios because we've told you we don't know how they've looked at each event and each scenario and worked with our first responders and said, is this acceptable? In that context, NEB did find that the information on evacuation provided by Trans Mountain was insufficient, but that it could be supplemented post-approval. That's condition 123. Now, again, supplemented means what? Supplemented means just submission, presumably to the regulator, which is the National Energy Board. Does that mean that here, any one of you, or I, or Chris, or anybody, will have an opportunity to see what that really is, and whether it's an acceptable plan? So, unfortunately, these are key issues that still remain outstanding and of deep concern to the city. What I'd like to do, as I say, for those of you that don't have the letter, because the mayor goes on to speak about the NEB process, the lack of diverse expertise in a situation where we have industry captured regulator. And then he goes on talking about many matters really regarding NEB to have failed to undertake a rigorous review process. I would ask that you read this letter that we've submitted. We haven't received any response. Don't know, Karen, if we're going to expect a response. Yeah, that'll be a report to their superiors as to what they think we should all be doing. But please visit our website. There is a link to this. And I think that concludes our part of the presentation as it relates to what was being asked of us. Thank you, Carl.
And now I'll introduce Bob Hackett. He is a professor of communications at Simon Fraser University.
Thank you. Can you hear me back there? Is that okay? I've grouped the questions into about 4 or 5, and many of them are about the specifics of the threats from the tank farm to Burnaby. So there's a lot of questions for Chris. If you're ready. I've sort of grouped them and edited them a bit. So first set of questions is, how cooperative has Kinder Morgan been with the Burnaby Fire Department in the last year or so, and have you learned anything useful? Why has KM refused to disclose its full emergency response plan? Do you think it's because it's just inadequate? The NEB now has an office, this may be for Dipak, I don't know, in Vancouver. Have you requested someone from there to come to our meetings and answer questions? So that's a start. A couple more questions about the risks. How would community members be alerted to an evacuation order? Has there been any evacuation drills? And if you were a resident of Burnaby Mountain, what would you do to prepare for that emergency possibility?
So about Kinder Morgan's cooperation, the process, there was, I don't know, Dipak, thousands of hours spent posing questions. So the process for the NAB submission and the questioning from the city, we took very serious, diligently, and honestly asked questions from the proposal for the project. And where we asked questions, commitments were made where we asked the how. How are you going to meet that commitment? We, very uniformly, I think, received increased vague answers to very simple, very direct questions. So as far as cooperative with the Burnaby Fire Department in the last year or so for their current facility, they say they want to help us, they want to be involved, they want us to be involved. It seems to take a long time to get some very simple things done. So we can read through between the lines there. But we look at that and we assess it and we move on and we continue to ask those hard questions. Why has Kinder Morgan refused to disclose its full emergency response plan? I think typically the reason you do not want to disclose your full emergency response plan is you don't want people to know what the risk is. I think fundamentally that people living next door to you should know what's going on, to make their own decisions, to decide whether they stay or they go. So I don't know why they wouldn't. I'm not sure. We continue to ask those questions. Let's see if I can find another one here. As far as evacuation, the fire department has put in place significant evacuation plans. So of highest priority for us is the community. Their facility and their infrastructure within the facility is of less concern except where we need to intervene as it affects the public. Meaning if they have a loss of assets within the facility, we're not as concerned about that. Our primary focus has been developing those evacuation plans within the community so that if and when an emergency occurs there, that the city puts its fire service between, as we do at any building fire, any type of harm, that our first goal is to put us and our people between you and them. The resources are going to be there for us to look at. We know where people are. We want to know if we get early indications of what's going on. We're going to move people away as soon as possible, but we're going to put our people between these farms and yourselves. That's our primary focus. So evacuation is a key thing. There's still some issues as far as Simon Fraser and how that'll take place. I think that's a pretty tricky one because of just the geography and how we would move people in and out. But we're working on that, and we're looking at how we can best deploy the fire service within the city to protect you and the public first and foremost. Anything else? All right. All right. Okay. All right. You're not going to break in at any moment and save me or Dipak. You're just going to.
There's a question. I don't think we answered it in fairness.
Okay.
I'll take a run about the process.
I think there was a question around, has Kinder Morgan been cooperative? It depends on how you define cooperative. I guess our strategic position has always been to work through the National Energy Board in an open and transparent way, because we believe doing anything else could land us in trouble, because, as I say, I truly don't know what that cooperation is. But I think there's one question that you asked, Bob, about the National Energy Board's office in Vancouver, and if we've gone down there and met with them. No, we haven't met with the National Energy Board in their current office in Vancouver. That is not to say that we have not had dialogue with the National Energy Board in various forums. As a matter of fact, the National Energy Board staffers will be making a presentation to some local governments tomorrow of the amendments to their existing regulations. So we do have that dialogue. But did we go to their offices physically? No. But we do have dialogue that is regular dialogue with them. I think those were the questions that we had that we didn't get to. Is it here? Well, I guess you should ask and or make a request, and let's see if they do want to face the community.
Okay, Chris, if you're ready, I've got about 5 questions on very specific aspects of risk assessment. One has to do with hydrocarbons and other chemicals in the area associated with jet fuel loading and unloading and the loading of tankers of various products. Another has to do with flammable gas outfall and the release of sulfur-based gas and blast zones. A third one is the condition of the existing 60-year-old tanks and whether they and the connected pipes might be upgraded to current standards, acceptable standards. Fourth one is earthquakes. And number 5 would be, is it possible that there could be a landslide that, like there was in Oso, Washington, that could actually affect the tank farm, perhaps lead it to slowing down? And finally, this is a grim one to stand off with, is there any estimated loss of life for a boilover or a fire should they happen? So they're all here.
All right. Let's start at the beginning. I think the first question had to do with the marine terminal and jet fuel facilities, loading tankers, and please comment on the safety risks to the public in the area or response from the City National Energy Board. Okay, so hydrocarbons, I mean, part of the essence of the facilities business model is they profit from handling dangerous products. If they were handling water, there wouldn't be as much profit in it. A question, I guess, politically that each person has to ask themselves is it the city's responsibility to take on all the safety of handling that dangerous commodity, or is it part of the business principle to which they interact? So jet fuel, the one thing I'll say is jet fuel is really, it's a lot like diesel fuel. It's one of the, when we hear about jet fuel or rocket fuel, they get mixed up. Jet fuel is a lot like a kerosene. It's a very heavy hydrocarbon. It does have off-gassing, as some of the questions. It is flammable. A great concern of those heavy fluids is when they hit the water and the control of that, when they hit the land. We talked about what it would take to remediate that. Even from an immediate response perspective, you know, we saw what happened in the oil, the pipeline loss from Kinder Morgan a few years back, and the immense costs in the area and impact to the environment and the community. These are real risks. There was a question about sulfur-based gases and blast zones. For sure, there's Kinder Morgan themselves in their submission identifies, I believe it's a 5.2 kilometer potential outfall of sulfur-based gas in their risk assessment. So if you take their facility and you go 5.2 kilometers in any wind direction, it encompasses almost all of North Burnaby into Coquitlam, into Vancouver, and parts of North Shore. The sulfur-based compounds that could be released from the facility are toxic. So in their risk analysis, they say the outfall of those sulfur gases is up to 5.2 kilometers. That's a significant outfall area, and there's a significant population there. As far as blast zones go, I I guess what we're talking about is a boilover. A boilover is the most catastrophic event in sudden occurrence of a tank fire. Meaning a tank fire that can't be extinguished quickly. It basically, the water in crude oil sinks to the bottom. It gets heated up as the fire burns for a longer period of time. As the crust on the top of the tank sinks, that water is being compressed and heated. And when the water gets heated to the boiling temperature, water expands to somewhere between 1700 and 2300 to 1. So that volume of water at the bottom of the tank is massively going to expand. It's just a force of nature, and that would expel all of the heated components within that tank. So all that heated oil gets jettisoned in a range of about 10 tank diameters. So for a 200 meter tank, 200 meter tank, you're looking at magnitude of another 2,000 meters of discharge of heated oil. Most hydrocarbon facilities will deny, even up until recently, denied the possibility that this has occurred. But anybody in the emergency response industry and an industrial base knows that this is exactly what happens. The science proves it out, as we've seen before. The concern there is, with this facility, is you can prevent these events if you can access the tank and you can extinguish it in a reasonable amount of time. Due to the density that we looked at in those tank farms, I showed how close those tanks are and how it may prevent the fire service from being able to safely access those areas without basically burning up people to do it. And if they're unsuccessful, that tank continues to burn and potential exists for a boil. Not an exciting thing. If you're going to have a risk, you need to understand what the risk is. You need to have a plan for minimizing it or eradicating it. But you can't just hope that it's not going to occur. The risk analysis, in my viewpoint, that Kinder Morgan did for this proposal for the project was infantile at best. The 60-year-old tanks that we asked during the proposal, with the city's responses to questions, if the company would commit to, if the project was approved, would it commit to rebuilding all of the tanks, all of the infrastructure to today's standards? So if it did get approved, would the facility be first class, industry best in all aspects, and there was no commitment made? And I think, yeah, it was just a dodge the question, Dipak, is that correct? Yeah, there wasn't a lot of substance to the answer. Landslides, I'm not a real expert in landslides. I have concerns though about the tunnel and exactly what that's going to look like. I think in many of these instances, Dipak, I may have a better understanding of that. But I do know that the mountain, Burnaby Mountain, is like all ecology, is fragile. And I think that it's important to understand it's fragile and how important it is to us. And it's a good question on what could go wrong. There are models around the world of what could go wrong, and I would have concerns in that aspect. But I can't comment on the geological side of it. Estimated loss of life for a boilover. The only advantage of a boilover is it tends to take place over like a 12-hour period, so we have a large window of time to move people away out of those areas. It would be a big task to send people back and out of those areas, but a boilover is something that occurs instantaneously. It comes for a long time, you have no way to prevent it if you're at that state, but I would expect a boilover to have not a significant loss of life with the oversight the city would be providing in that event. It would have catastrophic event, fire.
It's just like Burnaby.
just like,
Right, the Fort McMurray, they get the people evacuated, asked them Pete out in 16 minutes, that's
Right.
all.
right. So, but the greatest concern about, one of the greater concerns about the facility is the impact on life, but also any fire that is uncontrolled for even a short period of time risks Burnaby Mountain. It risks a wildfire that moves very rapidly through the wooded area, and could encompass a good portion of the mountain and that ecology. I think that's it.
Yeah. Is there a question on seismic?
Yeah, that's one of them.
Okay. Oh, I see. I can answer that.
So somebody had raised the question of earthquake or seismic risk. And we have written to the panel as well that that's an outstanding issue from our perspective. So when we looked at their technical reports, we found that there wasn't sufficient information on seismic risks as it relates to fault mapping and assessment of sites. And they had delineated these as very high, moderate liquefaction triggered ground movements. That work hadn't been completed for those of you that are following this storyline. So when we asked that question, and of course the board in its report says, well, the preliminary information from Trans Mountain is sufficient, and that seismic studies could be undertaken and filed with the NEB only 3 months prior to construction. Again, the word filed. And if you want to refer or cross-reference that, it's condition 68 and 69 of the National Mission Board report. So that would be on page 68 of the document. What we find here is the fact that the rigor that has been applied to the project is not there. I mean, why put the conditions that are critical in understanding this health and safety of residents in the proximity? And I think Chris has alluded to the boil over, etc., not be provided and assessed thoroughly prior to giving a green light. Why is there no cross-examination of the critical technical information to make sure that it is thorough and valid? So.
One more question, which probably is best perhaps dealt with by Chris, is if there's anything more you want to say about how residents of Burnaby County would prepare for an emergency. Because, and I can speak as a member of SFU's community, that we probably aren't as engaged and aware as we should be on this. So would you perhaps be willing to come and speak to the SFU students and staff?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reason I'm here today and any other day is not to facilitate the political side, but as a representative for you and an advocate for you of fire and safety within the community. I'm here on a factual basis. I'm here to give you, the citizens, the people who live in our community and use our community, the information that they don't technically otherwise have. That's the purpose, is for you to have access to understand the risks in your community. Preparing for an emergency is always, it's a reality when you live in the 21st century. So I think it's important to understand it, to educate yourself on what could occur, to understand what resources are available and are coming and in what way, to understand what your personal responsibilities are in that and how you can acclimatize yourself to where you're living and what the potentials are, so that when that day comes, that you've got a head start on how the city's going to deal with it, how the department's going to deal with it, and move forward. Of course, we hope that exists for the tank farm in its current state and not a proposed state.
3 final questions I'll group together, very brief ones about more on the political process side. Is there a mechanism, a legal mechanism, where we could actually go after Kinder Morgan's license to do business? Is there any indication that Burnaby's safety concerns about the tank farm expansion have been heard at the federal level? And finally, will Mayor Corrigan be there to lead protests if there's more confrontation on the mountain? There was a supplement to that where somebody asking where was he during the 2014 exploratory drilling protest, but I believe Mayor Corrigan did answer that in public, that the city was filing a legal challenge at that point and didn't want to be wearing two contradictory hats at the same time. So, three aspects there.
So I'll start off with a question that says, is there any indication that our city's safety concerns regarding tank farm expansion have been heard at the federal level? I would have to say, and I won't speak on the political side, I will try and answer it as a staffer, but having gone through all the reams of 15,000 pages of their technical documents and having gone through arguments with the National Energy Board, I would say that they must have heard us, but did they do something about it is another question. Simply saying that, yes, as I've given you quite clear examples from the National Energy Board, that yes, we recognize that the implications and risks to the neighborhoods and all those aspects that is being raised by the city are valid. They've said that. But what did they do? They've simply put that off to the industry to file a report. So I'll leave it at that. So the other one that, I think the one about the mayor and the Burnaby Mountain, that's been answered by and large, so I'll skip that. The other question that came in was, has Kinder Morgan shown a callous disregard for health and safety of the public, first responders, and even their employees in their tank farm design and stonewalling on the emergency response plans? I don't know if I can say callous disregard, but I do say that they have not been inclusive and understanding and thoughtful and responsive to the community as a whole. I think that anybody who says that I'm here to create jobs, to make sure that we operate in a safe manner, would have been saying that if the first responders wanted to look at their safety plan to ensure that the citizens are safe, would not have good conditions, would have worked with our first responders in an inclusive way. They argue that there is sensitive information in that document that could harm them. I know even the province of British Columbia challenged that. And I must say they Kinder Morgan, treat us in the province say no to you and no to them. So at least I feel better that way, that we're, as the most third level government, we're not differentiated as long lost cousins to how they treat the provincial side of the business. And is there a mechanism legal where we can go as far as go after the company's business license? I would have to speak to our solicitor on that, because they're federally regulated, and how does the local business license work. But I must say that from my perspective, you know, there are opportunities that we can all look for collectively to still keep on working hard against some of the onslaught that we're seeing, and look at it both from an operational perspective and legal perspective. So those doors are always open to all of us. And I think council is saying right now they'll still continue the fight. So I would just stop at that.